mother. Elizabeth thinks about her future. My husband and I think about her future. But do our political leaders in Idaho think about her future?
No.
Do they have a realistic plan for what will happen when the support structures of Medicaid are gone?
No.
Our political leaders look at the Medicaid budget and see it as a place that is ripe for slashing. They say government is not a substitute for charities and families. They say volunteers will step in to fill the gaps. But can volunteers really bail out Medicaid?
No.
First, let's look at the good news. We need to thank our fellow citizens because when it comes to donating time, Idahoans are some of the best in the country. Over 1/3 of Idahoans serve as volunteers. These 412,000 Idahoans volunteer in churches, schools, hospitals, civic organizations, and sports. They contribute over 57.7 million hours of service. On a per capita basis, Idahoans donate 51.3 hours per resident, ranking us as third among the 50 states. The dollar value of the hours contributed is valued at $1.18 billion. This is nearly half of our state budget. Let's give an enthusiastic thank you to our Idaho volunteers. But this is where the problems come in. Estimates indicate that Idaho would need nearly 2.25 million volunteer hours to replace the services that will be lost under the proposed Medicaid cuts. Our current Idaho volunteers are each already giving about 140 hours per year, far above the national average. Yet our political leaders want to ask them to give more, or to take volunteers away from churches and schools. In 2009, 35% of Idahoans volunteered. In addition to this 35%, 27% of the population is under the age of 18. Another 12% is over 65. Another 12% are people with disabilities. There may be a little overlap, but that accounts for about 86% of Idahoans. Have our leaders determined where the volunteers are who will donate the more than 2 million additional volunteer hours that we need? Show us the answer to this question.
Yeah!
The leaders of Idaho don't want to overburden us with taxes, but they are completely willing to overburden the already busy lives of some of the most giving people in the nation. And what will we be expecting these volunteers to do? They will be asked to work with some of the most vulnerable groups imaginable. The potential for abuse is enormous. Every volunteer needs to be screened. We need to know their criminal and driving history. They cannot be pedophiles. They cannot be sexual predators. We need to know that they will not physically abuse, sexually abuse, financially abuse, or hurt in any way people whose voices are already faint. Once the developmental disability agencies have been dismantled, who will screen the people working with our children and our vulnerable adults? And who will train these volunteers? As a parent of a daughter with autism, these are some of the concepts I expect a developmental therapist to be familiar with. Sensory integration, sensory overload, fine and gross motor deficits, generalization of skills and executive function. And these are some of the skills I would expect a developmental therapist to be able to understand and run programs on. Adaptive strategies, including coping with transitions, perceptual skills, self-regulation, and community mobility. This list is daunting. And this is only autism, and it's only my list. Think of all the disabling conditions that exist. Cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, quadriplegia, organic brain injury, Alzheimer's, Lou Gehrig's disease, the list goes on and on. Think about the many hours of training the average volunteer would need to begin to understand the scope of their work. Yet under the state's plan, we don't know who will provide this training. We must also consider commitment and retention. Once the volunteer is trained, will he commit to work 5 or 10 or 20 hours a week? Our leaders don't want volunteers, they want an unpaid workforce. The current retention rate for volunteers is low. Do people with disabilities have to expect to work with a new volunteer every 2 weeks, every 2 months? And consider the lag time. Think about asking a completely paralyzed person to wait for 2 weeks for a new volunteer to help him get out of bed in the morning. Volunteering to help our most vulnerable citizens is not the same as typing letters for the church deacon or running the school carnival. Consider the unpredictability. People with cognitive impairments do not always understand the consequences of their choices. They do not always understand society's rules. And even when they do not always have the coping strategies to stop, think, and make good choices. Think about what a volunteer would do when a person with autism becomes overstimulated by the Christmas lights at the mall, runs off to hide and no one can find him. Think about what a volunteer would do when a girl like my daughter becomes suddenly terrified by a hedge trimmer and she tries to grab the volunteer but grabs the steering wheel of a moving car instead. Consider the insurance issues. A volunteer goes to her insurance agent and she says, I'm going to be spending 10 hours a week with a person with a cognitive impairment. He's 14, he's nearly 6 feet tall and weighs 180 pounds. He's really sweet, but he once unbuckled himself and jumped out of the car on the connector. Will my umbrella policy cover me if anything goes wrong? The potential liability issues are overwhelming. And consider the worst. Someone with a cognitive impairment becomes physically aggressive in a public place. Can we expect an untrained volunteer to de-escalate the situation? Will the volunteer be able to keep everyone out of harm's way? And do we all agree that we will simply accept the tragedy if a law enforcement officer feels she has no other choice but to shoot?
No.
Our leaders are asking too much of Idahoans, too much in terms of time, and even more critically, too much in terms of responsibility. Responsibility that should only be placed on people who are trained to understand the disabilities they are dealing with, trained to handle the sometimes nerve-wracking situations that can arise, and most importantly, trained to handle dangerous situations that become emergencies if they're handled wrong. Volunteers are not a real alternative to Medicaid. And maybe our volunteers already know that maybe our political leaders already know that volunteering is not the solution. Maybe they know there is no pool of volunteers standing around to help. And maybe they know that those millions of hours aren't coming from anywhere. And maybe our Idaho leaders have already made a decision. First, we will abandon the disabled. Then we will institutionalize them. Then we will turn them out on the streets.
No!
Then we will arrest them. Then we will incarcerate them. And then what?
No.
At what point on this continuum do a society's actions become immoral? At what point does inhumanity begin? Is this the vision our leaders have for our fellow citizens?
No.
One of the chairpersons of JFAC stated in an interview that she appreciated the testimony that was given before JFAC, but that in the end, the decision had to be based on the numbers. She meant the number of 2011 tax dollars. But our legislature also needs to make the decision based on the number of dreams broken, the number of families that collapse under the burdens, and the number of lives lost. It also needs to make this decision based on the damage to our collective soul as we turn our backs on the people who need us most. But we can have a different vision. We can know that it could happen to any of us at any time. We can tell our legislature that helping people with disabilities means more to us than tax cuts. If 412,000 of us are willing to give $1.2 billion in volunteer service to our fellow man, Maybe we could also give an amount in tax dollars that would preserve services that we cannot replicate with volunteer hours. For me, a few extra tax dollars is a small price to pay to help every young girl like Elizabeth work toward her dream of being independent. It is a small price to pay to make sure that every Idahoan can live his or her life with a sense of dignity. Thank you.